Thanks very much. So the question for my co-author and I started from is a pretty simple one. When is it actually worthwhile to outsource a computation? So what do I mean? Well, here's the setup. So let's say I have a weak computer. Say I have like my cell phone, right? And I want to do some heavy computation, but the cell phone can't really do it very well. So I send it to the cloud, right? I send it to Amazon and it does the computation for me and sends back a result. But maybe I don't trust the result is correct. So I ask it to prove to me that the result is correct. And this is something that comes from theory. There's been 3 decades or more of work on this problem. And in the last 5 or a little more than 5 years, researchers have started to turn this into practice. And it's a really active research area, so I'm sorry if I've missed your system. I probably have. But the point is, all these systems are out there, but maybe the question we should be asking is, like, when would we actually use them? So one time that we would actually use them is when they give us an application that we couldn't otherwise achieve, right? So in the case, let's say in a zero-knowledge proof, like we're going to see in the next talk, there we actually, the computation can be over data that my weak computer doesn't have and never sees, right? So that's a great application. But in this talk, I'm going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about just the case where I want to save work, right? I want to send my computation to the cloud and I want to save work. And so that's the question that we started from. And specifically, the goal that we're going to have is that outsourcing should be less expensive than running the computation locally on the trusted machine. Okay, so pretty simple goal. Okay, so what are the costs? How do we make it less expensive? Well, there's a verifier that has to verify the proof. And theory tells us that at least asymptotically, checking that proof should be cheap, right? Great, okay. So then we have a prover, and the prover has to actually generate a proof. And unfortunately, the overheads there are often massive, like 8 orders of magnitude or something. And then finally, there's some pre-computation. This isn't necessarily the case from theory, but in practice, basically all the implemented works require this computation-dependent, but input-independent pre-computation. And usually the cost of running the pre-computation is about the same as running the computation itself. Okay, so how do we actually handle these in systems that exist today? Well, the pre-computation is often an amortized thing. So you reuse the same pre-computation over many computations. And what that means is we would believe that we would be willing to use the system just when we need to run the same computation many times, but over different inputs. Okay, that's sensible. For the prover, unfortunately, a lot of these systems end up just kind of assuming that the prover's computation is free or close to free, maybe 8 orders of magnitude cheaper than running locally. And maybe that's sensible in some cases, right? Like maybe my cell phone really is, I have a limited battery on the phone. I can't do the computation without sending it to the cloud. Okay, maybe that's fine. But what we're going to look at here is a system that we call Giraffe that actually, what we do is we carefully account for all of these things and we say, even if we sum up all of these costs, that's still less than running the computation locally on a trusted machine. And one reason that we can do this is that we actually are in a slightly different environment. We're in the trustworthy hardware context, and there the prover is actually affordable. And we're going to see why in a few slides. So at a high level, what does Giraffe do? It extends some previous work called Zebra with an asymptotically optimal proof protocol that improves on some work from Justin Thaler, some concrete improvements to all 3 entities, the verifier, the prover, and the pre-computation. And we built this compiler that sort of generates optimized hardware designs from a subset of C. And so the bottom line is that Giraffe actually makes outsourcing worthwhile in the hardware context, sometimes, subject to some limitations that we're going to see in a little bit. Okay, so later in the talk, I'm going to tell you how Giraffe works, and we'll see some evaluation results. But first, let's talk about this hardware context, which we call verifiable ASICs. Okay, so imagine we want to build like a custom chip for, say, a network firewall, right? We need a high-performance chip. We want to build a custom network firewall packet processing chip. Okay, so we don't own a way to make chips, right? A fab. So we're going to send our design off to a fab, and they're going to send us back a chip, right? But the problem is that the fab may actually insert a backdoor into this chip, right? And so if they do, maybe that backdoor is going to listen for some magic sequence of packets, and then once it sees those, it's just going to, let an attacker through to say, take over my cell phone. Okay, I don't want that. But so is this a realistic threat? Well, so this is actually a headline from 5 years ago. The CNN was reporting that fake gear has infiltrated the US government. So the worry there is that some of this fake gear may have some of these backdoors in it. And in fact, the US government takes this very seriously. So they have this program that they call the Trusted Foundry Initiative. And there they use things like a chain of custody or background checks or security clearances to make sure that the people who are actually building the chips are doing so in a trustworthy way. And that seems crazy, and it seems extremely expensive, but the reason for it is that there's this active research area of attacking chips, of building these backdoors that are extremely hard to detect. And that research area is very active because there's a lot of ways to do it, and they're all kind of very interesting. So there was A2, which was a malicious CPU. There was these stealthy dopant level Trojans is actually backdooring the random number generator in the Intel CPU. So these are very interesting attacks. Okay, so we use trusted foundries to get around it, but that's maybe not the best idea either, or at least it's not a full solution. First of all, if we actually want to use a trusted foundry that, let's say we're only going to trust one that's in our country, well then we better be lucky enough to be in one of the few countries that actually has such a foundry, right? Otherwise, we'd have to spend billions of dollars and years of R&D to build a foundry in our country, right? And otherwise, let's say we're going to say, well, we can find a fab in our country. It's not the best fab, maybe it's 10 years old. Well, in that case, now you're going to pay orders of magnitude in terms of performance. So to make this concrete, in India, let's say that the government of India wants to build a chip and they demand that it's going to be built in India onshore. Well, in that case, unfortunately, given the available manufacturing in India, they're going to have to pay sort of 8 orders of magnitude in terms of the performance of that chip compared to state of the art. Okay, so that seems pretty bad. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to apply that same outsourcing technique, but in the hardware context. So specifically what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to build a really fast but untrusted chip. And then we're going to use a trusted slow chip to outsource computations to the fast chip and then just check the proofs. Okay, so specifically, this is the verifiable ASICs model. So let's say we have F, some computation that we want to run. And so what we're going to do is we're going to design 2 chips that we call the prover and the verifier. Now the prover we're going to build in an untrusted but fast fab, right? We can build that anywhere we want, fastest fab we can get, doesn't matter if we trust them or not. The verifier we're going to build at our fab, the one that's trusted but slow. Now we're going to put them together into a single device, and that's the device that we run. So let's say I want to run a computation. I hand an input to the verifier. It sends the input to the prover, and then it gets back an output and a proof. It checks the proof, and if the proof is good, then it outputs the result. Okay, so is this practical? Well, okay, let's think about the costs. The verifier overhead, it turns out, is actually cheap for computations that we care about. So the verifier is good. And the prover's overhead is very high. But here, remember, we're relying on the fact that we can get a much faster untrusted technology than the trusted technology. So we can manage the cost of the prover by just using a fast enough technology. So this is great, right? Verifier plus prover, we're done, right? That's less than the cost of the whole thing. Well, no, because remember, there's this third cost, right? We need pre-computation that's somehow proportional to the cost of running the function in the first place. And so prior work, how did it get around that? Well, it said, yeah, maybe a courier comes to your door every day with a hard drive that's full of the pre-computations, and you use those, and you're great, right? So somehow they come for free from somewhere. We don't know where. So we don't want to assume that away. Now, this time, what we want to do is say, look, all 3 together, verifier, prover, and pre-computation, that's going to be less than executing the function. Okay, so that's the goal in Giraffe. So let's take a look at how Giraffe does that. Well, at a high level, what Giraffe is going to do is take a program, that's F, that we've been talking about, and compile it into a verifier chip and a prover chip. Okay, and we're going to break this out into sort of a front end and a back end. In the front end, we take the program and we turn it into an arithmetic circuit, such that the arithmetic circuit's satisfiability is tantamount to correct execution of the computation. Okay, so if for some inputs and outputs, the arithmetic circuit is satisfiable, that means that the computation on those inputs would have produced those outputs. Okay, and then in the back end, what we're going to do is use a proof protocol so that the prover can convince the verifier that there exists such a satisfying assignment to this arithmetic circuit. Okay, so if the proof is valid, then the verifier believes the computation is done correctly. Okay, and here we're going to concentrate mostly on the back end. We have some talk about the front end in the paper. Okay, so the back end is based on GKR, Goldwasser-Klein-Rothblum, from '08, and more recently, that is an interactive proof protocol, and sort of follows a line of work. So after GKR came Kormod, Mitzenmacher, Thaler in 12, that improved the cost sort of for any computation compared to GKR. And then Thaler 13 reduces the pre-computation cost associated with CMT for certain kinds of computations. It imposes some structure on the computation. We'll see what that is. And then Giraffe, it leverages exactly that same structural requirement now to reduce the prover's cost. Okay? So I'm going to describe a little bit about how all these systems work, and throughout I'm going to be applying a nice simplification due to Justin Thaler. Okay, so how does GKR work? Okay, the function f, we express it as a layered arithmetic circuit. So by layered, I mean the inputs go to one set of gates, and then those outputs go to another set of gates, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there are layers in the circuit. Okay, so now the verifier sends its inputs to the prover, and the prover is going to compute. It's going to evaluate the arithmetic circuit to produce some output. y, and then it sends y back to the verifier. Now the verifier is going to construct a polynomial that relates the output that the prover has just provided to the structure of the circuit, the structure of the output layer of the circuit. And then it's going to engage the prover in a protocol that convinces the verifier that the outputs are true contingent on some statement about the second last layer of the circuit. Okay, now the prover at this point, or the verifier at this point, might say, well, I can just check that statement. But unfortunately, that would be as expensive as executing the whole computation up to the last layer. So it can't do that. But instead, it can recurse. It can apply the same technique again to reduce the statement about the second last layer to a statement about the third last layer. And then it can apply it again and again. You can see how eventually what we're going to get is a statement about the input to the computation. Well, the verifier knows the input because it's the one who provided it. So then it can just check the statement directly. And once it's been convinced of that, then it knows that the computation was run correctly. Okay, so the sum check here that I've got in the bottom is sort of the soul of this thing, and we're going to break that open to see where the costs are for the prover and for the pre-computation and how they've improved sort of from GKR to CMT to Thaler to us. Okay, so in GKR, for each layer of the arithmetic circuit, remember the prover and the verifier are going to engage in a sum check. And the prover, this is a little ugly, but don't worry about it. The prover is going to sum over this big ugly sum in the first round of the sum check. And the important thing to notice here is the bounds of the sum. So this is a sum over sort of 2 log g points on a binary hypercube, which means if we think about it, that the prover has to do sort of g squared terms, has to sum g squared terms in the very first round of the protocol. And then there are a logarithmic number of rounds. So we know that the prover's work is at least sort of polynomial in g. And now remember, there's d layers, there's many layers in the circuit, so that's basically polynomial in the width of the circuit, and it's linear in the depth of the circuit. Sorry, d is the depth and g is the width. Okay, and then the pre-computation, well, I haven't told you yet what the pre-computation is, but in fact, it's these, you see these add tilde and mul tilde, those are basically the pre-computation. One evaluation of add tilde and one of mul tilde. And by the same argument, basically, those are also polynomial. So now the pre-computation in total then is linear in d and polynomial in g. So that's where we stand to start. Okay, so now what we want to do is reduce both of those costs. And the first thing that we're going to do is, what that CMT does is it says, look, any arithmetic circuit that we're going to operate on actually has some structure to it that we can use to our advantage. And specifically, what they observe is that these wiring predicates, add and mul, basically they're always 0, except at very, very few points. Okay, so add is basically defined as, this output and these 2 inputs correspond to an add gate in the circuit. So concretely, we have a layer of an arithmetic circuit, and if you're used to seeing the inputs on the bottom and outputs on the top, sorry, I've swapped it. So the inputs are on the top, and we have labeled each of them, and the out labels are on the bottom. So the only add gate here has out label 3 and in labels 2 and 3. So that means that add is only 1 when its arguments are 3, 2, 3. And otherwise, add is 0, right? So we don't even have to bother to sum over those terms. We know they're always 0. And similarly, we know that the multiplier predicate is always 0 except at 3 points. Okay, so what we can do then is we can rewrite the prover's work in the first round of the sum check as just a sum over the gates in the circuit rather than a sum over the points in the binary hypercube. Okay, so now we've just shrunk the work considerably. And if we think about it, that means that it's linear in the number of gates in the circuit per round of the protocol, and there's logarithmic number of rounds. So now we have something that's quasi-linear in the size of the computation. So that's the prover's work. How about the pre-computation? Well, we can use the same trick to make the pre-computation sort of cost about as much as the circuit does. Okay, well, that's still too much. We want to bring that down. And so what Thaler observes is, well, we can impose just a little more structure on this, and we can use that to really reduce the pre-computation cost. So that structure in particular is, instead of outsourcing 1 copy of a computation, we're going to outsource a whole bunch. So now we have n copies of the same circuit, and that circuit has depth d and width g. Okay. And here, in a nutshell, the observation is, if we've done it this way, now the wiring predicates are, in some sense, small. So what do I mean? Well, now we have a layer with 2 copies of the same circuit. This is the one we saw before. And just like before, we're going to say that the add predicate is only 1 when its arguments are 3, 2, 3, right? And so importantly, what that means is it doesn't comprehend at all which copy of the circuit we're in. We just know that no matter what copy we're in, the wiring predicate is the same. Okay, so the reason that's cool is because that means that evaluating the wiring predicate is only as expensive as one of the sub-computations, but that evaluation is essentially amortized over all of the copies, over all n copies. So that's great. Okay, how about the prover's work? Well, things have gotten a little nastier. Again, don't worry about it. We're going to see what happens. But we've added another little wiring predicate here. It's just 1 when its inputs are the same. Okay, and so what does this sum say? In a nutshell, it says for every gate in a subcomputation, for every subcomputation, we're going to add one term to the sum. Okay, so if we have a logarithmic number of rounds in the protocol and each one has sort of n times g work for the prover, then we have this work that's at least sort of ng log g for the prover. So we still have this pesky logarithmic term, and that's what we're going to try and get rid of in Giraffe. Okay, so how does Giraffe do that? Well, basically the idea is we're just going to kind of rearrange things a little bit. We're going to have the prover compute essentially the same sum, but in a slightly different way. And the result is that it gets to do a little less work. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite the sum slightly from the last time. And again, I'll walk you through what it means. And we're going to change the order of the sum check protocol. So now we say for each subcircuit, sum over each gate in that subcircuit. Okay, it doesn't seem like we've done much so far, but notice the inner sum has limits that are related to the number of gates in the circuit. The outer sum has limits that are just over this binary hypercube. And round to round in the sum check protocol, that binary hypercube is collapsing. So in the first round, it's got log n points. In the second round, it's got log n minus 1 points. As you can see, the binary hypercube collapses, and the result is that the prover is going to do n plus n over 2 plus n over 4, etc., right? Which just sums to 2n, right? So now we have something that's sort of ng plus g log g. Okay, we still seem to have a log term there, but notice that if n is bigger than log g, now this is actually just linear in the size of the computation. Okay, so what we've done is we've imposed a little bit of structure on the computation, and then we've been able to leverage that structure to reduce both the prover's work and the pre-computation work. Okay, so practically speaking, this sort of ends up being maybe an order of magnitude in terms of the prover's work reduction, which is nice. Okay, so let's pop up a few levels. If your eyes have glazed over, it's okay. Blink a couple times. We're gonna be back in reality here, and we'll look at some evaluation results. So what is Giraffe? Well, like I said earlier, it's sort of an end-to-end hardware generator. So we have what we call a hardware design template that's parameterized by the computation, and then some sort of hardware things like, well, we're going to build it in this fab with this size transistor, that sort of thing. And then we have a subset of C compiler, so it doesn't quite support all of C, but it's most of it. And that reduces a program to the input format for the template. Okay, so that means we can go all the way from C to a hardware design. And we're going to see one of the applications later. That's exactly what we did. Okay, so then the evaluation that we do is basically an end-to-end one. So given the front end and the back end, we say, well, we're going to start from C and we're going to run something and we're going to see how it performs. And remember, the goal here is somehow that the total cost, verifier, prover, and pre-computation should be less than just running the computation locally on the trusted chip. Okay, so that's one of the baselines. Like we're going to run F, our trusted computation, in the same technology that we would build the verifier in. And the other baseline is Zebra, which is the prior work. Okay, and then in terms of metrics, what we're going to look at is total energy consumption. These things are highly parallelizable, and so it's not just a matter of wall clock time, because somehow you could cheat by just adding more hardware to it. So instead, we look at energy, which is to say, in some sense, the total size of the computation if it were stretched out in a line. Okay. In terms of measurements, basically what we did was we synthesized the circuit. We used sort of standard techniques for figuring out how much power these things cost. We looked at sort of published chip designs and standard models that we used to sort of project what things would look like in one technology based on what they look like in another technology. Okay, and we're careful to charge essentially for all of the costs, for the verifier, the prover, the pre-computation. In terms of the technology, what we're going to say is that the prover and the verifier are separated by about 20 years. So I can get the newest technology for the prover and something about 20 years old for the verifier. And then finally, we have some sort of practical constraints. Like you can't build a huge chip. You can only build sort of a reasonably sized chip. And that chip can't burn too much power or else it just melts. Not so good. Okay, so the first application we're going to look at is curve 25519. You're probably very familiar with it. The idea, it's an elliptic curve, and we're looking at point multiplication on the curve. Okay, so here's a graph that's sort of a little confusing, but okay, the y-axis is energy, so lower is better. And we have sort of three systems here. We have Giraffe, we have the native computation executed on the same technology as the verifier, and then we have Zebra. Okay, and we see a couple things. First, Giraffe has sort of two regimes. On the left side of the graph, it's dominated in its costs by the pre-computation work, right? So it's essentially independent of how many copies you run. It's still, no matter what, the pre-computation is most of the work. But once we are running enough copies on the right side of the graph, then its costs essentially go with the per instance cost of the protocol. which is nice. Okay, and then the other thing to notice is that Zebra is always cheaper than Giraffe. Why? Well, it doesn't pay for the pre-computation, right? So it's cheaper. We don't pay for some of the computation. That's fine. But it doesn't scale to as large a computation. Why? Well, the protocol improvements mean that Giraffe is able to, on exactly the same hardware, run about 500 times larger computation than Zebra could. Okay, then the other application that we looked at was image matching. So this is an FFT-based image matching benchmark. And we started from a C implementation. We wrote it in C. We compiled it all the way to hardware, and that's what we used. No hand tweaking. That was end-to-end C to hardware. Okay, and in this case, we only compare the native and Giraffe because Zebra just can't handle this benchmark at all. And once again, we see the same thing. On the left side of the graph, we're dominated by the pre-computation cost, and on the right side of the graph, we're dominated by the per instance cost. Okay, so we started out asking, are these systems practical? And we have to turn that same question to Giraffe now. So is it practical? Well, okay, it's restricted to batched computations or to data parallel computations because of the underlying proof protocol. And that's definitely a restriction, right? That means that certain computations that we want to do, we can. But on the other hand, I haven't talked about them. Our front end actually includes these sort of static analysis passes that's able to extract sub-pieces of programs that are amenable to outsourcing, that are parallel from bigger programs. So that means you run the piece that you could outsource by outsourcing it, and you run the rest of it locally. And the result still, in many cases, can save compared to just running the whole thing locally. And we're hopeful that further work along these lines means that we can outsource even more programs in the future. Okay, but on the other hand, Giraffe's proof protocol and optimizations save like an order of magnitude compared to the prior work and let us scale, as you saw, to about 500 times bigger computations, which means that Giraffe really is the first system that accounts for all of these costs and actually wins under some very specific set of assumptions. So Giraffe is a step, but it's not the last step by any means. There's plenty of work to do, and we're encouraged by what we've got so far. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Brian Parno, Carnegie Mellon. Enjoyed the work and the talk.
Thanks.
So, quick question for the baseline. You said you were compiling from C to hardware.
Yes.
So, I don't do a lot of hardware, but I've been told that those C compilers exist, but they're not what most people would use for when designing an ASIC, for example.
Absolutely. But remember here, it's very stylized, right? What we're doing is producing a prover and a verifier. So somehow the space of the result is much smaller than it would be if we were just trying to compile to generalized hardware. So yeah, that's absolutely true. There's a ton of research on going from C to super optimized hardware. But in this case, we essentially know everything about what the hardware is going to look like ahead of time, except the pieces that relate to the computation. So what the compiler is really doing then is tweaking a sort of a framework, that design template, to optimize it for a particular computation.
Okay. So you feel like the baseline that you're comparing against is the same that a hardware designer would come up with?
Oh, so in the case of the baseline, well, in the case of the applications that we looked at, somehow, well, let me back up and say this. You're absolutely right in the general case that, say, if we were trying to compete against like a processor, then maybe this isn't the best approach, right? Another applicability constraint that I neglected to mention on this slide, and I apologize for that, is essentially the computation that you try to run needs to somehow fit into an arithmetic circuit really nicely. And it turns out that something like elliptic curve point multiplication, that's perfect, right? It's over a field, it's sort of a bunch of adds and multiplies, and life is good. Right? There are plenty of other things that are not so good. If we tried to run a processor inside an arithmetic circuit, then the costs blow up a whole lot. Not so good. If we have to do a whole bunch of bitwise operations, again, not so good. So that's a restriction on the applicability, but somehow when we're running on a computation that can be expressed as an arithmetic circuit, then yeah, this is I think these baselines are very reasonable.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
So as a follow-up question, did you guys consider FPGAs? Because you're taking a program in C, which may not be the right representation, and you're producing an ASIC out of it. Next program, next ASIC. As opposed to compiling to an FPGA, which again, you have the same problem of having a trusted foundry make the FPGA, an untrusted foundry make the FPGA. But when you reprogram the FPGA, you just got an ASIC-like performance on the same chip without requiring to go to the foundry again.
Yeah, so this is a very, very good question. So the question was basically, can you use an FPGA instead of an ASIC? And basically, as soon as you try to think about using an FPGA instead of an ASIC, you open up a whole new space of questions that you want to answer. So one is, well, do we just trust an FPGA because it's so general? How could you even backdoor the thing, right? So in fact, there are trust. Oh, absolutely, you can have backdoor an FPGA, but maybe in some trust models you say no, that there's not going to be any backdoor. So some people have actually used FPGAs as sort of a basis for the trust, which is an interesting thing, but I think that would be an assumption on top of what we're doing here. So another set of questions you have to answer is like, well, if we're going to use an FPGA, how much are we paying for the generality of the FPGA? In the case of the verifier, maybe that would be okay. And in that case, again, you'd have to make this assumption that you trust the FPGA. In the case of the prover, unfortunately, even if we use the most cutting edge FPGA we can find, compared to an ASIC, like, okay, it's faster than a processor, but the FPGA isn't even close to competing with an ASIC, right? Yeah, but it's like, I don't know what people tend to say, but like in my head, it's like we build an ASIC. If we build an FPGA instead, we pay 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. If we go to software, then we pay another 2 to 3 orders of magnitude on top of that, right? So somehow, like, in some sense, like you're giving away performance by going to an FPGA instead, right? Which is totally fine if you want to be able to reconfigure. So yeah, that's absolutely an interesting possibility. But now you have to start worrying about the performance, and possibly you opened yourself up to some new possible assumptions as far as trust goes.